The world had once been full of life, bustling cities, crowded streets, and the hum of everyday activity. But now, silence had taken over. It was a silence so deep, it felt as though the earth itself had held its breath, waiting for the inevitable to unfold. Buildings stood like tombstones, windows shattered, and streets once filled with the laughter of children now echoed with an eerie stillness. This was the world that Ryan found himself in, a lone survivor in the wake of a global catastrophe. The apocalypse had come without warning, turning friends into enemies and family into memories. The infection spread fast, faster than anyone had ever imagined. What started as a distant rumor, a virus spreading across the seas, had become the death knell of civilization. People who were bitten became something else, something monstrous. They didn't die, they just changed. The dead walked, hungry for the living, while the living tried to hold on to whatever shred of humanity they had left. Ryan had been lucky, or perhaps unlucky, to be among the few who had managed to survive when the outbreak first began. He hadn't seen the virus hit his small town in the mountains, but when he had heard the news, he packed his bags and ran. He had no destination, no plan, only the hope that he could outrun the inevitable. But that hope was waning now. For weeks, Ryan had been traveling across abandoned highways and through desolate forests, his only companions the whispers of the wind and the haunting groans of the undead lurking in the shadows. It was strange, the silence. He had grown so used to the sounds of the world that now, even the smallest noise felt like a threat. A branch snapping underfoot, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl of a creature that had once been human, all kept him on edge. Ryan had learned to be cautious. Every corner was a potential danger, every shadow a hiding spot for the undead. The infected were not like the stories of slow, lumbering creatures that people used to tell. No, these were faster, more vicious. They could sprint, climb, and, worst of all, think. The virus had changed them in ways no one had anticipated. As he made his way through the ruins of a city that had once been teeming with life, Ryan couldn't help but wonder if there was anyone else out there, anyone else still alive. He hadn't seen another human in days. The loneliness was worse than the constant fear of being caught by the infected. It was late in the afternoon when he stumbled upon the remnants of an old store. The windows were boarded up, and the door was ajar. It was the first sign of civilization he'd seen in days. Without hesitation, he slipped inside, pulling his backpack tighter to his chest. The smell of mold and decay hit him immediately. The shelves were overturned, cans and bottles scattered across the floor like forgotten relics. Ryan moved quickly, scanning the area for any signs of life, or death. He knew better than to linger in one place for too long, but hunger gnawed at him. He hadn't eaten a proper meal in over 48 hours, and his stomach made its discomfort known. His eyes scanned the shelves, looking for anything that could sustain him. After a few moments of searching, he found a can of beans and a bottle of water. He let out a sigh of relief. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He opened the can, using his knife to pry off the lid, and took a long drink from the bottle. As he ate, his mind wandered back to the days before everything changed. Before the world had descended into chaos. He remembered the warmth of the sun on his face, the sound of his sister's laughter, and the way his mother used to hum a lullaby as she cooked dinner. Now, those memories felt like a lifetime ago. It was hard to remember the world before the dead began walking. Suddenly, a noise broke through his thoughts. A low growl, followed by a series of scraping sounds. Ryan froze, his body tensing as his hand instinctively went for his pistol. He crept toward the back of the store, where the noise was coming from, his breath shallow and quick. There, in the dim light, he saw it. A pair of eyes gleamed from the darkness, glowing faintly in the shadows. Ryan's heart skipped a beat. The infected. It was only one, but he knew that if there was one, there could be more. And if it had heard him, there was no time to waste. Without thinking, he sprinted for the door, his mind only focused on escape. But as he reached for the handle, the door slammed shut with a loud bang. Panic surged through him as he turned, eyes scanning for another way out. He was trapped. A voice echoed in his mind, one he had heard far too often since the world changed: "There's no safe place anymore." The infected were closing in. Ryan had two choices: fight or flee. And as the shadows moved closer, he knew that this was a decision that would decide whether he would survive another day. The store, once a shelter from the outside world, now felt like a tomb. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, everything around him seemed to blur into a cacophony of panic. The low growl of the infected echoed in the back of his mind, mixing with the sound of his own breathing, rapid and shallow. He turned to face the creature, the infected, a mere silhouette in the dim light of the store. Its eyes gleamed with an unnatural hunger, and its ragged breaths filled the air. Ryan could feel the weight of his situation pressing down on him. His hands were trembling, and his thoughts raced. He had faced the undead before, but this was different. He had no room for error now. He backed away slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. His mind raced with plans of escape, but there was nowhere to run. The back door was locked, and the front was blocked. He cursed under his breath. In these kinds of situations, survival meant adapting, thinking fast, and relying on instincts. The infected took a step forward, its foot scraping against the broken floorboards. Ryan's eyes scanned the room frantically. A broken broomstick lay on the floor nearby, and a pile of debris sat against the far wall. A plan began to form in his mind. It wasn't much, but it was his best chance. He grabbed the broomstick, feeling its weight in his hands. The infected didn't move any closer, as if waiting for him to make the first move. Its head tilted slightly, observing him with a strange, animalistic curiosity. Ryan felt a surge of cold fear, but it was quickly replaced by determination. He couldn't afford to freeze up now. He forced himself to breathe steadily, taking a step back. The infected made another low growl, inching closer. Ryan's grip tightened on the broomstick, and in a split second, he launched himself forward, swinging the stick at the creature's head. The impact was jarring, the wood cracking against the infected skull with a sickening thud. The infected staggered back, a gurgling sound escaping its throat. Ryan didn't hesitate. He darted to the side, searching for anything that could help him escape the trap he was in. The infected recovered quickly, its movements jerky and uncoordinated. It lunged at him, teeth bared. Ryan ducked, narrowly avoiding the creature's grasp. He had only seconds before it came after him again. His mind screamed for a way out, but all he could do was run. His feet slammed against the floor as he sprinted toward the door. But it was too late. The creature was right behind him, too close for comfort. Ryan could hear the rasp of its breath as it chased him, its footsteps a rhythmic pounding in his ears. He reached for the door handle, his hand shaking as he twisted it, and it was stuck. Panic surged through him again. There was no time. He glanced to the side, spotting a narrow window just above the counter. He could squeeze through, but the creature was already almost upon him. His decision was made. With a swift, desperate motion, Ryan jumped onto the counter, barely clearing it as the infected swiped at his feet. He turned and scrambled up, throwing himself toward the window. He gripped the sill, his fingers numb from the cold metal. The infected slammed into the counter below him, but Ryan had no time to look back. With one final push, he hauled himself through the window, his body scraping painfully against the glass as he forced his way out. He landed hard on the ground outside, his knees buckling under the impact. The air was cold, and the streets were eerily silent once more. Ryan took a moment to catch his breath, his heart still racing. The danger was not over yet. He could hear the infected pounding on the window behind him, the creature clawing at the frame, but Ryan didn't wait to see what it would do next. He had escaped for now, but he knew that every moment in this world was a gamble. The sound of the infected's growls began to fade as he sprinted away, his eyes scanning the abandoned streets for any other threats. There was a deep sense of dread in the pit of his stomach. Every corner he turned, every shadow he passed, felt like it was watching him, waiting to strike. His hands were covered in sweat despite the cold, and his legs ached from the run. He hadn't eaten or rested in far too long, and the hunger gnawing at him was a constant reminder of the fragility of his situation. There were no guarantees. In this world, survival wasn't just about evading the undead, it was about finding something to cling to: hope, food, shelter, anything that could give him the strength to keep moving forward. As he ventured further into the city, Ryan could see the ruins of buildings that had once been homes, businesses, and places of comfort. Now, they were just empty shells, haunted by the ghosts of those who had once walked the streets. For a moment, Ryan felt a deep sadness, the weight of what had been lost crashing down on him. But then, a new realization hit him. He wasn't just walking through a city, he was walking through a graveyard, and every step he took was a reminder of how fragile life had become. The infected may have taken everything from him, but Ryan wasn't ready to give up yet. He couldn't afford to. There was still a world out there, and he was determined to find it, or whatever was left of it. The city stretched out before Ryan like a maze of broken dreams and crumbling foundations. The world he had known was gone, replaced by the silent ruins of a civilization that had once seemed invincible. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty streets. As the last rays of light faded, Ryan knew that darkness would bring its own dangers. The undead were always more active at night. Ryan's pace slowed as he walked, exhaustion setting in. He hadn't had a decent night's sleep in days, and the constant stress of survival was starting to take its toll. His stomach growled in protest, a reminder of the meager meal he had earlier. Every step felt heavier, but he pushed on, knowing that rest was a luxury he couldn't afford. He turned a corner and found himself in front of an old, abandoned gas station. The structure was in shambles, but it looked like it might offer some shelter for the night. Ryan eyed it cautiously, knowing that such places were often used by both survivors and the undead alike. But the silence around him was deafening, and there were no signs of immediate danger. He decided to take the risk. The door creaked as he pushed it open, stepping into the dim interior. The air inside was stale, filled with the smell of mildew and decay. Shelves that had once been stocked with snacks and supplies now stood bare, their contents long scavenged. There was a small counter at the back, with a door leading to what appeared to be an office. Ryan moved quietly, listening for any sounds of movement. His hand hovered near the grip of his pistol, ready for whatever might come. After checking the small room for any signs of life, he felt a slight sense of relief. It was clear. The gas station, like so many other places he had passed through, had been abandoned long ago. Ryan collapsed onto the floor, leaning against the counter. He closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to rest. But sleep wouldn't come. His thoughts kept returning to the infected, and to the haunting memory of the creature he had just escaped. What if there were more of them nearby? What if they found him in the night? His mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. The silence in the gas station was oppressive, as if the very air had been sucked from the room. Ryan tried to focus on the present, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the past. To the people he had lost, to the world he had lost. He had heard stories of how fast the virus had spread, how entire cities had fallen in a matter of days. Ryan had been fortunate to escape the initial outbreak, but he knew that his luck could only hold out for so long. Suddenly, a distant sound broke through the stillness, a low, eerie growl. Ryan's eyes snapped open, his heart racing. The growl wasn't close, but it was enough to send a chill down his spine. The infected were out there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting. He stood up quickly, his body tensing. The sound grew louder, and he realized it wasn't just one. There were more. His pulse quickened as he moved toward the window, careful not to make any noise. He peered out into the street. At first, he saw nothing. But then, from the shadows, they emerged, a group of the undead, moving slowly but steadily in his direction. Ryan's mind raced. He needed to make a decision, and fast. He could try to wait them out, but he knew that would only work if he could stay hidden. The infected were relentless, and sooner or later, they would find him. Or he could try to make a break for it. The city stretched on for miles, and he didn't know what dangers lay ahead. But staying here meant waiting for the inevitable. With no time to waste, Ryan grabbed his backpack and crept toward the door. He peeked through a crack in the window again. The infected were getting closer. There were at least 6 of them, moving in a loose formation. They weren't running, but their slow, purposeful steps were enough to tell Ryan they were on a hunt. They had already picked up his scent. Taking a deep breath, Ryan slid the door open as quietly as he could, slipping into the shadows. His heart pounded in his chest as he crouched low, moving quickly but carefully along the side of the gas station. The infected were now directly in front of the building, their eyes blank and unseeing as they shuffled past, their growls filling the air. Ryan moved with practiced precision, staying in the shadows as he crept away from the gas station. He had to keep moving, had to stay one step ahead. The infected may have been relentless, but he had learned the hard way how to survive by staying hidden and staying silent. As he moved further down the street, he couldn't help but wonder how much longer he could keep this up. How many more nights like this could he survive? The world was a wasteland, and every day felt like a fight to hold on to whatever scraps of hope remained. But in the silence of the night, with the infected lurking just beyond his reach, Ryan knew one thing for sure: the world had changed, and there was no going back. The streets ahead were dark, but Ryan didn't hesitate. He knew he had no choice but to keep moving forward. Whatever lay beyond the ruins of this city, he had to find it. He had to find something. Anything. The silence of the world was too deafening, and the danger of the infected was too close for comfort. Ryan had survived this long, but how much longer could he keep running? The night seemed to stretch on forever. Ryan moved through the city with no destination in mind, just the instinct to keep putting one foot in front of the other. His body ached with exhaustion, his stomach gnawing at him in hunger, but the thought of resting or stopping to eat felt like an impossible luxury. The constant dread of being followed, of being hunted by the infected, kept him alert and on edge. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not even for a moment. He passed abandoned cars, their windows shattered and their bodies rusted, remnants of a life that had once been filled with purpose. He couldn't help but wonder where all the people had gone. Where had the survivors gone? He hadn't seen anyone in days, and the isolation was starting to feel suffocating. The streets felt more like a graveyard with every passing minute. The only sounds were the distant growls of the infected and the wind whipping through the skeletal remains of buildings. Ryan came to a large intersection, the streetlights long since dead, casting everything in a blanket of darkness. He stopped for a moment, looking around. There were no signs of movement, no zombies, no survivors. Just an empty world. His eyes scanned the surroundings, hoping for something, anything, that would give him a clue of where to go next. And then, in the distance, he saw it, a faint flicker of light. At first, it was so small that he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. But as he focused, he realized it wasn't just his imagination. There, in the distance, was a building with lights on. Real, living lights. He froze, a mix of disbelief and hope flooding through him. Could there really be someone else out there? Could it be a survivor? His pulse quickened, and for the first time in days, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long while crept into his chest: hope. It was a dangerous thing, he knew. Hope could lead you into traps. But the thought of being alone in this world forever was far worse. He couldn't resist. Ryan adjusted the strap on his backpack and took off toward the light, moving quickly but cautiously. Every step felt like a gamble, but it was one he was willing to take. As he drew closer, he noticed that the light wasn't from a single bulb, but from a collection of windows lit up from the inside. It looked like someone had set up a small barricade, maybe even created a safe zone of some kind. He moved faster now, his body pushing through the pain. His legs felt like lead, and his throat burned from thirst, but he pressed on. His mind was focused solely on the building ahead. It wasn't much, but it was a sign that he wasn't the last person left. When he finally reached the building, he paused for a moment, crouching behind a broken-down car to assess the situation. The light from the windows seemed to flicker erratically, as if the power was unstable. But Ryan didn't care. He needed answers. He needed something to break the crushing loneliness he'd felt for so long. Taking a deep breath, Ryan approached the door of the building. It was locked, but the doorframe looked weak, as though it hadn't been properly maintained in a long time. He carefully tested the door, pushing against it gently. To his surprise, it creaked open just enough for him to slip through. Inside, the building was quiet, too quiet. The air smelled stale, with a faint trace of mildew. He moved cautiously through the dim hallway, his footsteps muffled by the old carpet. His eyes adjusted to the gloom, and he could make out the faint outline of what looked like a living room area. It was sparse, with only a few chairs and a table, but there were signs of life. A candle burned on the table, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Ryan crept forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea who or what was inside, but he couldn't stop now. His mind raced with possibilities. Could they be hostile? Would they welcome him, or would they see him as a threat? Suddenly, a noise from the back of the building made him freeze. A soft thud, followed by a voice, a human voice. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. It was low, almost a whisper, but there was no mistaking it. There were people here. He took another cautious step, then another, moving toward the source of the sound. As he turned a corner, he saw them, two figures standing in the dim light. They looked like survivors, their clothes ragged and worn, but they were alive. The man was holding a flashlight, his face grim but alert, while the woman stood nearby, a crossbow slung over her shoulder. Ryan froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol at his waist. The man's eyes locked onto him in an instant, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the woman spoke, her voice calm but wary. "Who are you?" Ryan swallowed hard, his mind racing. He hadn't expected to find anyone so soon. He could feel the weight of their gaze on him, their uncertainty matching his own. I'm just a survivor," Ryan replied, his voice hoarse from days without proper rest or food. "I'm looking for others. I haven't seen anyone in a long time." The man didn't lower the flashlight, but his expression softened slightly. He looked to the woman, then back at Ryan. "You're not alone," the man said, his tone quiet but serious. "But you'd better be careful. This world's not what it used to be." Ryan nodded, feeling a mix of relief and trepidation. He wasn't alone anymore, but he knew that survival in this new world would be more dangerous than ever. The infected were everywhere, and so were the threats from other survivors. Trust was something he couldn't afford lightly. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Ryan allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was still hope. The man and woman exchanged a brief look, their faces revealing the guarded wariness that came with surviving in a world filled with threats both living and dead. Ryan could sense their caution, and he understood it. He had been alone for so long, and the idea of trusting strangers in a world where survival meant everything was as terrifying as it was necessary. "I'm Ryan," he said, breaking the silence. "I was just looking for some sign that I wasn't the last one left." The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gave Ryan a once-over, his eyes narrowing slightly as he scanned the stranger's worn appearance. Ryan felt the weight of the scrutiny, but he didn't flinch. His clothes were tattered, his face unshaven, and his eyes reflected the exhaustion of days spent running and hiding. Still, he held his ground, trying to convey that he wasn't a threat. After what felt like an eternity, the man lowered the flashlight slightly and nodded. "I'm Ben," he said, his voice rough but not unfriendly. "This is Emily." He gestured to the woman beside him, who nodded curtly, her crossbow now slung more casually across her back. Her eyes never left Ryan, but her posture seemed to soften ever so slightly. "Are you alone?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. "The roads out there aren't safe. Not with the infected and others." Ryan hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. He wasn't sure he trusted them yet, but he knew that honesty was the only chance he had at gaining their trust. "I've been traveling alone for a while now," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the admission. "I haven't seen another living soul in days." "Lucky you," Emily muttered, her tone flat. "We've had our fair share of unwanted company." "Where are you heading?" Ben asked, his eyes narrowing. "There's not much left out there. You've probably seen it already." Ryan's gaze flickered to the windows, the ruined city visible in the dim light. The silence outside was oppressive, as if the world was holding its breath. He thought about the city, about the distant flicker of light he had seen earlier, and the flicker of hope that had driven him to this building. "I don't know," Ryan said honestly. "I just need to find something. A place where it's safe. Maybe a community, if that's still a thing." Ben and Emily exchanged another look, this one more uncertain. After a long pause, Ben spoke again, his voice lower now, as if testing the waters. "There's a settlement," he said. "A few miles from here. It's not perfect, but it's something. It's got walls, people, and food." Ryan's heart leapt, but he kept his expression neutral. "How many people are there?" "Not many," Emily answered, her voice quieter this time. "We've all been trying to rebuild, but it's hard. Trust is hard." Ryan nodded in understanding. He had learned that lesson the hard way. The world they now lived in wasn't kind, and trust could be a dangerous thing. "I'll take what I can get," he said. "But I won't be a burden." Ben didn't respond immediately. He seemed to weigh Ryan's words carefully, as if measuring the sincerity behind them. Finally, he nodded. "We're heading that way in the morning. It's better to travel in the light, and we could use an extra pair of hands." Ryan felt a spark of hope at the offer. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, but it was better than wandering the city alone, hoping for a chance encounter with others. This was a chance, a real chance, at something more than survival. "Thank you," Ryan said, the words coming out more sincerely than he intended. "I don't have much, but I can help however I can." "Good," Ben said, nodding. "We'll leave first light, then. Get some rest, and we'll head out. We've got a long day ahead of us." Ryan looked around the dimly lit room, his eyes lingering on the simple furniture and the faint traces of life left behind. It wasn't much, but it was a place where he could rest, where he could sleep without fear of being stalked by the infected. The soft glow of the candlelight was calming in a way he hadn't felt in ages. For the first time in days, the world seemed a little less daunting. But as Ryan lay down on the floor, his body aching from the strain of days on the road, a feeling of unease settled over him. The world outside was a dangerous place, and no matter how much he hoped for safety, the reality was that no place was truly safe. He had learned that the hard way. And as sleep began to pull him under, his last thought was of the settlement Ben and Emily had mentioned. Could it really be a safe haven, or was it another trap in a world filled with deceit and hidden dangers? Ryan didn't know, but for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that there might be something worth fighting for beyond the ruins. Something more than just surviving. Tomorrow, they would set out. And whatever happened, he would face it. But for tonight, in this small room, with the flicker of candlelight casting shadows on the walls, Ryan let himself rest, if only for a moment. The morning would come soon enough, and with it, the next step in his journey through the ruins of a world that had fallen silent. Morning arrived far too soon. The sun barely peeking over the horizon cast an eerie orange glow on the abandoned city streets, giving the place an almost surreal, post-apocalyptic beauty. Ryan stirred from his restless sleep on the cold floor, his muscles stiff and sore. He groggily stood up, rubbing his eyes, trying to shake off the remnants of dreams filled with chaos and fear. The quiet was deafening, the stillness outside broken only by the distant groans of the infected and the occasional gust of wind that sent debris skittering across the pavement. Ben and Emily were already up, gathering their meager belongings. Ryan watched them for a moment, trying to read their expressions. They moved with practiced efficiency, clearly accustomed to this new, harsh reality. Emily was silent as always, her crossbow slung across her back, while Ben packed up what looked like a small bag of supplies. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, their trust in each other clear, but not entirely open. "You ready?" Ben's voice broke through the silence. It was calm, but there was a hardness to it, a toughness that came from surviving for so long in a world that didn't care if you lived or died. Ryan nodded, pulling on his jacket and strapping his backpack tighter. He hadn't packed much, just a few cans of food, water, and the essentials, but it would have to do. "Yeah. Let's get moving." As they stepped outside, the cold morning air hit Ryan's face, and he inhaled deeply, savoring the freshness that still lingered in the wake of the apocalypse. The streets were eerily silent, the usual hum of city life replaced by the constant threat of danger lurking around every corner. The distant sound of the infected shuffling in the ruins was a reminder that they weren't alone, and that any moment could bring new challenges. Ben led the way, his pace steady and sure. Emily stayed close behind him, scanning their surroundings with the careful watchfulness of someone who knew better than to let their guard down. Ryan brought up the rear, keeping an eye out for anything that might pose a threat. The city had once been alive with people and noise, but now it was little more than a ghost town, a decaying monument to a world that had been lost. They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows and avoiding open streets as much as possible. The ruins of the city were littered with the wreckage of civilization, burned-out cars, collapsed buildings, and the occasional, uncomfortably close sound of infected roaming nearby. Ryan's heart raced every time they passed an alley or a dark corner, half expecting something to leap out at them. But so far, the infected had kept their distance, as if they were drawn to other parts of the city, leaving the trio to make their way in relative peace. "So, this settlement you mentioned," Ryan said after a while, breaking the silence. "What's it like? How do you know it's still there?" Ben glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "We've been there before," he said. "It's not perfect, but it's a place with people. A place where you don't have to constantly watch your back." His voice faltered slightly, as if the mention of it brought up bad memories. "But it's not all good. There's a lot of competition for resources, and not everyone is as friendly as they seem." Emily spoke up from behind him, her voice sharper than Ryan had expected. "People get desperate when food and water are scarce. Sometimes, they'll do anything to survive, and that means turning on each other." Ryan could feel the weight of her words, and the tension in the air grew thicker. The world they now lived in had made everyone into potential threats, even the people they encountered who seemed like allies. Trust was a luxury, and survival came first. "I understand," Ryan said quietly, his thoughts drifting back to the countless times he had been forced to trust the wrong people. It was a bitter lesson, but one he had learned all too well. "I'll keep my eyes open." They continued their trek, moving through the ruins at a pace that was both swift and cautious. The city had long since fallen silent, save for the occasional groan or shuffle of the infected, and the air had a stillness to it that made Ryan uneasy. It was as if the entire world was waiting for something, holding its breath for the inevitable next disaster. As the day wore on, the trio stopped only for short breaks, each one more tense than the last. They didn't speak much, each of them focused on the road ahead. Ryan's mind wandered, imagining what the settlement might look like, a safe haven, a place where people were still trying to live, to rebuild. The thought kept him going, even as fatigue began to set in. By the time the sun was beginning to dip behind the horizon, casting the world in a dusky glow, they reached the outskirts of the city. The tall, crumbling buildings began to give way to open fields and forests, the landscape changing as they moved further from the city's heart. The land was scarred, but there was still life here, trees, grass, and the distant sound of birds. It was a reminder that the world had not completely died, even though the cities had fallen. Ben stopped suddenly, holding up a hand. "We'll camp here for the night," he said, his voice low but firm. "We'll be in the settlement by morning, but we don't want to risk running into trouble after dark." Ryan nodded, relieved at the thought of finally resting. The journey had been long, and the weight of every step had started to take its toll. As night fell, they set up camp quickly, making a small fire and huddling together for warmth. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them going for one more night. As Ryan sat by the fire, staring into the flickering flames, he couldn't help but wonder what awaited them at the settlement. Would it really be the safety they so desperately needed, or was it another dangerous illusion, just like the rest of the world? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but for now, there was nothing he could do but wait and hope. Tomorrow, they would enter the settlement. And with it, Ryan would step into the next chapter of his journey, for better or worse. The fire crackled as the night stretched on, its warm glow a small comfort in the vast emptiness of the world. The trio sat in silence around the camp, the only sounds coming from the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees or the distant howl of an infected far off in the night. Ryan's thoughts were scattered, racing between hope and doubt, his mind tangled in the same questions that had haunted him since the fall of civilization. Was the settlement really the safety they promised? Or was it just another mirage in a desert of despair? He glanced at Ben and Emily, who were sitting a little farther apart, each lost in their own thoughts. Ben had pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders, the flickering firelight casting harsh shadows on his face, while Emily, ever watchful, kept her eyes on the dark horizon. Neither of them spoke much, their bodies tense, ready for whatever might come. Ryan didn't want to break the silence, but the weight of the unknown pressed down on him. "So, when we get there, what's the plan?" he asked quietly, trying to keep his voice casual, though the anxiety crept in. Ben didn't look at him, but he answered with surprising honesty. "Get in. Get what we need. Get out. Simple as that." His tone was clipped, his eyes scanning the dark woods around them. "The people there, they're tough. It's not about making friends. It's about survival. And if you can't cut it, you don't last long." Emily's voice was soft but firm as she added, "Ben's right. Trust is a rare commodity now. And while it's a good place to rest for a while, you can't get too comfortable." Ryan absorbed their words, his stomach tightening. There was a coldness in their voices, a reminder that safety was a fragile thing in this new world. But there was no turning back now. The settlement was their only shot at anything resembling a future. The fire flickered once more before Ben stood up abruptly, brushing off his pants. "We should get some rest," he said, his eyes narrowing in the dim light. "We'll leave at first light." Ryan nodded, though he didn't feel tired. The adrenaline had been pumping through him for too long, and now, on the edge of what could be salvation, sleep felt impossible. Still, he lay back, staring at the stars above, their cold light doing little to soothe the fear gnawing at him. In the quiet, his thoughts wandered back to his family. His parents, his younger sister, memories of them, of the life they had shared before the world crumbled, flashed in his mind like old photographs. He could almost hear his sister's laughter, a sound he had once taken for granted. It hurt, remembering their faces, knowing they were lost to him forever. The thought of finding any semblance of normalcy now seemed so far out of reach. But this journey, this treacherous trek through the ruins, it was all he had left. And if there was even the slightest chance that the settlement could offer something worth fighting for, something more than mere survival, Ryan had to see it through. The night passed slowly, the darkness closing in as the fire eventually died down. Sleep came in fragmented moments, filled with dreams of running, of being hunted by both the infected and the shadows of his past. But eventually, the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a pale glow across the ruins. Ryan sat up, his body sore from the cold ground, but his determination unwavering. He saw Ben and Emily already up, packing their things. Ben was scanning the surroundings, his eyes sharp, as if expecting danger at any moment. Emily was more methodical, her movements calm as she checked her crossbow and gathered their supplies. "We ready?" Ben asked as he stood, brushing the dirt from his pants. His voice was low, a clear signal that there was no room for hesitation. Ryan nodded, swallowing the knot that had formed in his throat. "Yeah. Let's go." They moved out without a word, heading through the overgrown fields toward the settlement. The path was rough, winding through dense trees and the occasional patch of wild grass, the air thick with the scent of decay and nature slowly reclaiming what had been lost. The trek was quiet, with only the sound of their footsteps breaking the stillness, and Ryan found himself drawn into the rhythm of the journey. As they approached the settlement, the first sign of life became apparent, a crude wooden sign that marked the entrance, barely visible through the thick undergrowth. It was a simple structure, but it looked like a barrier of some kind, something meant to protect those inside from the dangers of the outside world. Ben and Emily didn't slow down, walking with purpose toward the gates. Ryan followed, his heart pounding in his chest. The gates creaked as they opened, revealing a small but organized settlement nestled between the remnants of what used to be a thriving town. The buildings were makeshift, constructed from salvaged materials, but there was a sense of order here that Ryan hadn't seen in months. People were moving around, talking, working. They looked different from the hollow-eyed survivors Ryan had encountered before. There was a sense of community here, of people who still held on to the hope of rebuilding. But even as Ryan took in the sight, something in his gut twisted. There was an underlying tension in the air, a feeling that couldn't be shaken. This was a place of survival, not a sanctuary. And just like everywhere else, the threat of danger lingered just below the surface. A man approached them as they crossed the threshold, his face hard, his eyes wary. Ben nodded in recognition, but the man's gaze quickly flicked to Ryan, assessing him with suspicion. "Who's this?" he asked, his voice flat. Ben didn't hesitate. "Ryan. He's with us." The man didn't respond immediately, his gaze lingering on Ryan for a moment longer before he nodded. "Fine. But you stay out of the way. We don't need extra mouths to feed unless you're useful." Ryan swallowed, feeling the weight of those words. He knew what they meant. In a world like this, usefulness was all that mattered. As they moved further into the settlement, Ryan couldn't help but wonder how long this fragile peace would last. How long before the tension here would boil over. But for now, it was the closest thing to hope he had seen in a long time. And so, with a deep breath, Ryan stepped forward, into the unknown. The gates creaked shut behind them, sealing Ryan, Ben, and Emily inside the settlement. The shift from the cold, empty world outside to this makeshift community was jarring. Here, amidst the rough wooden structures and salvaged tents, life pulsed in a way it hadn't for months. People moved about, tending to fires, repairing tools, and gathering supplies. It wasn't much, nothing like the world before the outbreak, but it was more than Ryan had dared hope for since the world fell apart. The settlement was a patchwork of structures hastily thrown together in the aftermath of the collapse. No walls to block the wind or fend off attackers, just quick, functional shelters built from salvaged debris. The people, too, had the look of survivors, weathered and worn by the harsh realities of the world they now inhabited. But there was something else in their eyes, an unspoken understanding of the unrelenting struggle to stay alive. Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that despite the small semblance of normalcy, something was off. The tension in the air was palpable. There were no smiles here, no welcoming gestures. The people kept their distance, watching each other closely, wary of newcomers, like animals in a pack. It reminded Ryan of how things had been before, when trust had been a dangerous gamble. They were led through the settlement by the man who had greeted them at the gates. His name was Marcus, and his demeanor was cold, but he was at least direct. "You can set up over there," he said, gesturing to a small, empty patch of ground near the center. "There's food and water in the supply tent, but don't get too comfortable. We don't like strangers hanging around too long." Ben, as always, kept his expression neutral, giving only a nod. Emily didn't speak, but Ryan could see the suspicion flickering in her eyes. She had been right. The people here were not the trusting sort. Their caution, their quick assessment of any potential threat, spoke volumes about the harsh realities they had endured to stay alive. Once they set up their small camp in the designated area, Marcus didn't waste time getting to the point. "You'll want to stay low for a while," he advised. "The settlement has rules, and you'll need to prove you can follow them. There's no room for freeloaders, and anyone who doesn't contribute, well, you don't want to see what happens to them." Ryan's stomach churned at the unspoken threat. He had known, deep down, that this wouldn't be the sanctuary he had hoped for. Everyone was here for their own survival, and when survival was at stake, there was no room for sentiment. The idea of being expendable, of not measuring up, was the harsh reality of this new world. Over the next few days, they were given tasks, clearing debris, gathering food, and helping with repairs. The work was exhausting, but Ryan welcomed it. It kept his mind occupied, gave him something to focus on other than the constant uncertainty. Still, the more he saw of the settlement, the more he understood the true cost of survival. It wasn't just the infected they had to fear. It was the people, the ones who would do anything to stay alive, even if it meant sacrificing someone else. Power was a currency here, and it was traded as mercilessly as any commodity. The leaders of the settlement were a tight-knit group, unbending in their rules. Their word was law, and if you stepped out of line, there was no second chance. Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking on thin ice. Ben seemed to share his unease, though he kept it buried beneath his usual guarded exterior. Emily was more distant than ever, her sharp eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. She wasn't letting her guard down, and Ryan followed her lead, aware that in this world, trust was a luxury neither of them could afford. It was on the fourth night, after a long day of labor, that Ryan witnessed the first signs of real tension. The settlement was quieter than usual, the usual sounds of people moving and talking replaced by hushed voices and sidelong glances. As Ryan passed one of the makeshift homes, he overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. "I heard there's a shortage of food," a woman whispered to another. "If things don't change soon, we're going to have to make hard choices." Ryan's breath hitched. Hard choices could mean anything, but he didn't like the sound of it. The thought of the settlement turning on itself, the last shred of hope he'd found in this wasteland, made him sick. He glanced over to where Ben and Emily were sitting by their campfire. Both had noticed the shift in the air. Ben's jaw was tight, his eyes scanning the settlement for any signs of trouble, while Emily sat still, her posture rigid. "Something's wrong," Ryan said quietly as he joined them. Ben nodded. "I've been watching. Tensions are rising. People are getting desperate." Emily's voice was sharp. "Desperation makes people dangerous. We can't stay here forever." Ryan didn't need to hear any more. He knew Emily was right. This place wasn't the haven he'd hoped for. It was just another danger zone, a place where survival depended not just on facing the infected, but also on navigating the politics of desperate people. The next morning, the settlement's leaders called a meeting. The air was thick with anticipation as everyone gathered in the center. Ryan stood with Ben and Emily, trying to look casual, but the unease was spreading fast. The leaders spoke of new rules, stricter boundaries, and the need to ration resources even further. "We've made it this far by sticking together," one of the leaders said, his voice cold but commanding. "But now we need to make sure that everyone pulls their weight. No exceptions. If you're not contributing, you'll be left behind." The warning was clear. Ryan couldn't help but feel the weight of those words. They were all just a few bad decisions away from being cast out, from becoming nothing more than another casualty of the apocalypse. As the meeting concluded, Marcus approached Ben, Emily, and Ryan. "We've got a mission," he said flatly. "We need people to go outside the settlement. Gather supplies. If you're interested, come by the supply tent in an hour." Ryan exchanged a glance with Ben and Emily. There was no telling what the mission would involve, but the offer was both a chance and a threat, a chance to prove themselves useful or risk being left behind. As they made their way toward the supply tent, Ryan's mind was racing. The reality of their situation was setting in. The settlement, with its false sense of security, wasn't going to be the answer. They would have to keep moving, keep fighting, and keep surviving, no matter what. The price of survival, he realized, wasn't just measured in food or water or weapons. It was measured in trust, in choices, in the willingness to betray or be betrayed. And as he walked into the supply tent, ready to face whatever came next, Ryan understood one thing clearly. In this world, nothing, not even hope, was ever free.